Hello, everybody. My name is Charlie Pioli. I'm with O-Town Compost, Orlando's community composter. This presentation, I will walk you through what composting is, vermacomposting, and why it's important to recycle our food scraps and not throw them in the trash. You can do the first PowerPoint slide. So, like I was telling you, O-Town Compost is a company I founded in the Orlando, Central Florida area about a year ago. We have a residential food waste collection service where we give you a 5-gallon bucket, an airtight lid. You fill it up with your kitchen scraps. We swap it out for a new one. We bring it back to our composting site and turn it into soil for your garden. We do zero waste events like weddings or birthday parties. And we also will partner with offices or restaurants to make sure that their food waste is ending up not in the trash or in the landfill. Currently, we're using a little bit more of a industrial style of composting. And for those who don't know, composting is it's when you have food waste mixed with a carbon material like leaves or wood chips, and that starts the bacterial degradation, and that organic matter turns into a black gold, I like to call it, or compost. And the key to composting is oxygen. And we use this method called aerated static pile method. And it's static. As you see this bin in the bottom of the screen, it just sits there. We don't have to turn it to get lots of oxygen, but it's hooked up to a blower and PVC pipes and forces oxygen into the compost pile. And with that oxygen, the microbes, the bacteria, they don't emit really bad odors. And, thank God none of my neighbors have complained. And it saves a lot of labor by not turning the compost pile. So O-Town Compost, our mission is not only to keep food waste out of the landfill, but by creating compost, we're supporting the local food system. People have the soil to grow their food in their own yards, or we donate compost to nonprofits like Fleet Farming. And overall, it's keeping our food local, and we're not buying food from California or Mexico. So you can do the next slide. This graphic kind of represents why I decided to start my own community composting business. I come from a background in solid waste and recycling consulting, and right now, recycling is really struggling. Recycling about 4 years ago in Orange County, they decided to convert dual stream recycling into single stream recycling. And they didn't really give residents or businesses like much education about what is actually recyclable. So now they're inundated with contamination, and that's like plastic bags and things that don't belong in the recycling. So in Orange County, at least 90% of the loads of recyclables are getting trucked to the landfill because they're just overly contaminated. They can't get any valuable products from it. So I pivoted from the recycling industry to what I think is better for the environment, has more environmental benefits, which is composting, and it makes up 40 to 50% of what's going to the landfill as it is. It's the lion's share of what's going to the landfill. So why not address the elephant in the room? For those who don't understand why food waste or any organic waste, including yard debris and textiles, why they don't belong in the landfill, I would highly recommend taking a field trip to the landfill if you can, but I'll describe how it happens. So they truck in your garbage, they dump it on the face of the landfill, and then every day by law they're required to cover it with a 6-inch layer of dirt or fill, rocks, something. And what that does is it cuts off any oxygen, it mummifies the organic waste under the fill, and it creates, without oxygen, it creates like a methane, and methane is 25 times more harmful as a greenhouse gas than CO2. Whereas if you were just to take your banana peel, throw it on the ground outside your house, and there's plenty of oxygen interacting with the banana peel, it's going to slowly degrade, but it's just going to disappear over time. That does emit CO2, but once you create a compost, by giving it that oxygen, you're also sequestering CO2. We store a lot of CO2 in our soils, and it's amazing every year when the farmers in the Midwest till their fields, it disturbs the carbon that's stored in the soil, and it emits into the atmosphere. So that's why it's important. Organic waste doesn't belong in the trash. You can either send it to the landfill where it creates much more potent of a greenhouse gas, or divert it to a composting program like O-Town Compost. Also, compost in itself is the foundation of soil health. And what I like to say is healthy soil equals healthy plants, healthy animals, and ultimately healthy humans. So it all starts at the ground level with the soil. Next slide. So, I'm sure some of you are gardeners and you've tasted the difference between a carrot or a tomato that's grown in your garden versus the ones you buy in the grocery store, the flavorless ones. And I think that's why it's important to, have good soil, good fertility that you can grow your own vegetables in. And being 29 years old, a lot of people in my generation are starting to realize that, there are holes in our current system, and we need to strive for a better, more sustainable system. We can't just keep, using tons of water to grow vegetables and then transporting them all the way from the, different countries or California. We want to create local garden networks or food networks where we can actually source our food locally and support our local farmers. Next slide. Orlando is a city prior to O-Town Compost that had no food waste recycling infrastructure. If a city wants to start diverting their solid waste, and the city of Orlando has a zero waste goal by 2040, they need to start planning infrastructure, and that includes composting sites, anaerobic digesters, something to treat the biosolids at the wastewater treatment plants. I was born and raised in Portland, Oregon, and that's an example of a city that has created an infrastructure, and all the residents have green bins that they take to the curb that contain yard waste and food scraps. And there is some contamination, but it's much lower than it is here in Orlando. And overall, the culture is more knowledgeable about why it's important not to trash your organic waste. This top picture is an example of aerated static pile they use in Portland, but much larger, and they're using, piping to force the oxygen in, or actually it's negative aeration, so they're pulling oxygen through the piles. And then on the right side, you'll see a berm of wood chips, and it's pulling the air through the piles. And that air might be, kind of smelly, and they have neighbors they need to worry about. They need to deposit the air in those berms of wood chips, which treats the air and suppresses all the odors. So it's a great way to not get a neighbor complaint. Community composting, is a great thing that, all it takes is a car and a pitchfork. And that's how I started, is just picking up some neighbors' food scraps and swapping out their bucket every week or every other week, and taking it back to my composting site and creating a soil that I return to my subscribers. Urban farms are great, community centers where you can teach a lot about composting. And I'm very excited to announce that we started a composting program at an elementary school in Winter Garden just this month. And that's teaching a whole generation of kids about, why it's important not to throw their food waste in the trash. And it's creating like a new behavior and changing overall their perception. They're never going to think the same way about throwing their banana peel or their carrot sticks in the trash can. Next slide, please. So the community composting is a grassroots movement that has been sweeping the country in the last decade. The big garbage industry like Waste Management and Republic Services, they've been more focused on managing landfills and collecting trash. And there hasn't really been a countrywide or a municipal solution for managing and recycling the organic waste. So a lot of small guys like myself and people with pickup trucks, or just with an intense passion to divert food waste, they've started growing their own businesses or nonprofits. And you can see that it's spreading across the country. Next slide. So I went to college in Boston, and I used to be a subscriber for Bootstrap Compost, which is a community composter that I've modeled O-Town Compost after. And they are amazing. They started about a decade ago, and now they're up to 2,000 residential subscribers. That's 2,000 households and apartments in the city of Boston that are, sending their food waste to the local farms. And Bootstrap, has a couple cargo vans. They're picking it up, and twice a year they return the finished compost to their subscribers. They've even expanded outside of Boston to suburbs around Boston, and recently Providence, Rhode Island. They have a great system where they don't do any of the composting themselves, but they bring it to local farms nearby. The farmers do the actual processing of the food waste, and they keep the majority of the compost to apply to their farms. Next slide, please. Another example of a great successful community composter are the Rust Belt Riders in Cleveland, Ohio. They're able to do 700 tons per year, keeping that out of the landfill. And they have some microscopes, so they're soil scientists. They can, tell if the compost they are creating is nutrient rich and is going to be great for customers. As far as soil science goes, the more life, the better. In 1 teaspoon of compost, there's a universe of bacteria and microbes that aren't visible to the eye, but the bacteria are like the taxis that bring the nutrients to the plant roots when you have your plants in the compost. Next slide, please. I think that composting can be done in any setting, no matter how urban. Big Reuse is an example of a composting site right under the Queensboro Bridge in Queens, New York. They're surrounded by, neighbors and activity, but they use this big breathable blanket over their compost piles to kind of suppress the odors, and they're able to do 15 tons of food scraps, recycling 15 tons a week. And a city of 8 million, New York City, their only solution for keeping that organic waste out of the landfill are these small community composters. And, New York City is insane what they're paying the contractors to remove the waste from the city. They're paying about $3 billion every year just to get the trash out of the city. And I've heard they've put it on rail cars and even brought it to landfills as far south as South Carolina. So real estate is pretty valuable in the Northeast, and New York City needs to come up with a solution fast to, make sure that they're not creating a ton of trash. Next slide, please. I would highly recommend the Netflix documentary Kiss the Ground. It was really inspirational, and we've gotten a whole plethora of volunteers who watched that movie and they were so inspired they wanted to get their hands dirty and emailed me to volunteer. But in Los Angeles, another big city, they have a community composter called LA Compost. And the way they do it is they have a network of community gardens and schools, churches around LA because it's such a sprawl, it's so spread out. And residents are able to bring their food scraps to the nearest community garden, to the nearest compost site. And they also, if they're going to be bringing their food scraps there, they also have to volunteer their time to, turn the piles and, track how much food waste is being diverted. But yeah, just in 1 year, they're able to divert around 250 tons of organic waste. I mean, Los Angeles has a long way to go to target all the food waste, but this is a great way to educate residents and get them more involved. Next slide, please. So in this portion of the presentation, I want to review, I want to talk to the backyard composters, those people who may not be ready for a subscription service like O-Town Compost, and they want to see if they can do it themselves. Just a little forewarning, it does take management, time and effort to turn your pile and to, add the food scraps in and mix your food scraps with the right proportion of carbon material. Typically, I recommend about a 3-to-1 mix. So 3 parts carbon, one part food waste. And carbon, like I said, it can be shredded paper, it can be leaves, wood chips, peat moss, The thing with composting, though, you need to make sure you have a moisture content between 50 and 60%. If you see ants in your compost pile, that's a good sign that your pile has dried out. And when it's dried out, there's no microbial activity. It's not able to really break down into anything. It just sits there. The first style of composting that I think is pretty popular is the tumbler. And that's one of those barrels that you just crank and it kind of tumbles it. I've seen it work. It takes about 6 months before you get anything that's like usable in your garden, and it doesn't provide the best oxygen in my opinion. And you need to like water, make sure that there's good moisture content in the tumbler. And remember that the tumbler is a batch composter, meaning you add food scraps and carbon in one big batch, and then you start the processing. If you're like me, you're constantly generating food waste. I have coffee every morning. I cook dinner, and I'm not able to really store my food scraps in little batches. So yeah, tumbler may not be the best. Here in city of Orlando, they provide these black bins called earth machines. I wouldn't recommend these. They're like big plastic bins. They don't provide much oxygen, and they do dry out easily in the dry season. And they're kind of hard to, they're impossible to turn unless you take off you just remove the bin from the material. As you can see in this picture, these are pallet bins. This is how I started with O-Town Compost, and this gave me like great flexibility. Gets plenty of oxygen. If it's rainy season, it has the right moisture content. You just have to turn it about every 3 or 4 days, and that gets the pile nice and hot around the 140-degree temperature. So even if a rodent or animal wanted to get in there and try to eat the food scraps, they would dig into the pile, feel how hot it is, and they wouldn't be interested anymore. Inevitably you are going to get like black soldier flies, which are these harmless larvae that, they're voracious eaters of any organic waste. So be prepared for them. I know some people think they're pretty yucky looking. Another style of composting are the composting trenches. Like imagine you have a garden, you dig trenches into your garden beds and just bury the food scraps. Once again, that kind of mimics what they do at the landfill, and it may emit methane. But I think overall, it's a pretty easy method to enrich your soil. And we live in Florida where we don't have soil, it's just sand. So you want to start creating organic matter in your garden, something that, the bacteria can feed off of. Anaerobic composting, same problem where it's emitting methane, but imagine you mixed all your carbon with your food scraps, took your hose, wet it down, and then put a tarp over it and secured it for about 2 months. When you lift off that tarp in about 2 months, you'll have something that resembles compost, and it'll be, usable. One sec. The bokashi method of composting is what they do in Japan. It's a Japanese method. And there's one community composter I just interviewed for my podcast. They're called the Compost Queens, based in San Antonio, Texas. And they're able to process 20 tons of food scraps every month using this bokashi method. And it's where it's anaerobic, so without oxygen. You have these flakes, this bran that you sprinkle on top of your food waste in like a 5-gallon bucket or a barrel, and then you put on the lid tightly so there's no oxygen, and it ferments the food waste. And typically, if you were gonna, have your food waste break down in an anaerobic environment, you'd lift off the lid and you would be slapped across the face with a foul odor. But this bokashi method kind of has like a sweet fermented smell, and it's really rich in microbes and bacteria. And if you dig that into your garden beds, I guarantee your plants will be really happy. Next slide, please. So odors and pests are two of the big concerns most people have about composting. And, our service with O-Town Compost, we handle the composting for you, so it's very convenient. But if you are looking to do backyard composting yourself, just remember that you're not going to get odors or pests if you're managing the pile correctly. If the pile is getting plenty of oxygen, that'll spur, like, the heat will be high. No pests no pests are able to get into a hot pile. If it's hot, that means the microbes are at work, and you're not going to get foul odors either. And if you do smell something, you could layer your compost pile with a thin layer of finished compost, and that would kind of act as a biofilter and suppress those odors. But I haven't experienced foul odors, but then again, I'm turning my pile regularly. I'm making sure that the moisture content is about right. My ratio of carbon to nitrogen is about 3-to-1, carbon being the browns, nitrogen being the greens. The food scraps are more nitrogen heavy, and leaves, wood chips, paper, that's the more carbon heavy material. Black soldier fly larvae are inevitable in our climate here in Central Florida. They're little, larvae, like they kind of look like maggots, but all they do is eat the food waste, and they recycle it, and they pupate into flies. And they don't even have mouths as flies, but they look like wasps. So, they may scare you, but they just die after a week after laying their eggs. So they're really not a concern. And, I argue to my commercial clients that by diverting your food scraps and separating it from your trash, you're really cleaning up your trash. All that's left is your paper and plastic, which is very dry and light. And, that's the heavy stuff is the organic waste. And by separating that and recycling it, your business is able to save money in the garbage collection costs and reduce the size of your dumpster, reduce how many times the garbage truck is servicing your dumpsters. So it's kind of like a win-win for a lot of businesses. Next slide, please. Vermacomposting is the name for composting with worms. Worms are pretty slow eaters of food scraps, but the three benefits of worms are that they produce a casting, a poop, that is really rich in nutrients, and your plants, it's an amazing fertilizer for your plants. The other reason is they recycle your food waste. They're a slow but efficient way of recycling your food scraps, and they'll eat just about anything, including citrus, even though that's one of the last things they eat. They don't love citrus, but they will eat it. They really prefer soft fruits like papaya and melon and cantaloupe, bananas. So if you really want to treat them to a great dinner, that's what you want to feed them. They're like chickens, so they have gizzards. They don't really have teeth. That's why you want to sprinkle a little sand on the food that you're eating, so that they can gain traction and kind of like digest the food. Um, for those who are interested, I recommend setting up a worm bin, which is pretty simple to do. Just in like a plastic storage tub, you drill some holes so they have air, and you add a layer of like bedding, which could be compost, it could be shredded paper, leaves, some kind of organic matter. You wet it down because it's make it nice and wet for them. Their skin is very sensitive to like light and dryness, so they prefer the dark. So make sure you have a lid on the bin, and then yeah, just feed them. Like drop in a whole bunch of food scraps. I keep my worm bins on my patio, and they stay cool. Florida red wigglers are the most tolerant to heat, so you want them in like a shady spot that they're not getting roasted. And if you like fishing, you have a constant supply of bait if that's what you're in it for. So next slide. So yeah, this is I appreciate having me on. It's been a real honor to be part of the HIC Orlando, speaker series. And the last thing I'd mention, we recently opened up service in the Sanford, Longwood, Lake Mary area, and we service pretty much the majority of Seminole and Orange counties. So if you're interested in subscribing for our convenient odor and pest free composting service, here's a code for your first month free. You can cancel anytime, but all our subscribers are pretty happy doing the right thing, keeping their food scraps out of the landfill, and we return about 40 pounds of finished compost to them every year. Yeah, so I'm happy to answer any questions. Let me kind of yeah, that's good to know that being a Muslim involves taking care of the environment. Were there any other questions that were in the comments section? Okay. Well, I think that was about it. And, once again, thanks for having me, HIC Orlando. Go to my website, o-towncompost.com, or you can contact me at info@o-towncompost.com. Thank you very much.